On December 31st, 1884, while families all over the country celebrated the coming new year, Austin, Texas became the site of a killing spree unlike any other. These murders shook the souls of those who lived nearby and left police baffled. While these killings took place more than 50 years before the term serial killers was created, Austin is known today as the first city to have a serial killer. What makes this case so tragically fascinating is that the killer was never apprehended and to this day remains unknown.
Austin, around the time of the murders, was thriving economically. It had a growing population of about 15,000 people. The city had become a hot spot for trade and new constructions, such as the state capitol building, which brought new jobs and railroads connecting the city to the rest of the nation. However, there was a growing number of crimes and murders occurring around this time as well, including the servant girl murders.
Over the course of 1 year, 8 victims were brutally murdered with weapons varying from an axe to bricks. 7 of these victims were women, and the other was a boyfriend to one. 6 of the victims were black, the other 2 white. The first attack was on 25-year-old Molly Smith on New Year's Eve of 1884. Molly was home sleeping with her boyfriend when the assailant entered her home, dragged her to the backyard, sexually assaulted her, and finally murdered her with a blow to the head made by an axe. The boyfriend was knocked unconscious during all of this and then murdered. The third victim was a servant named Elyse Shelley, a mother of 3. Eliza was murdered on May 7th in her home on East 3rd Street in San Jacinto Boulevard. Similar to the first victim, Eliza was also killed with an axe. Next was Irene Cross, who was murdered on May 23rd. She was brutally stabbed to death and looked to have been scalped.
The fifth victim was an 11-year-old girl named Mary Ramsey. Mary died on August 30th from an awful beating. Mary's death was what finally caused the public to be outraged due to her adolescence. The sixth woman was Gracie Vance, who was murdered on September 28th. It is said that she was found with her face pulverized by rocks. The last 2 victims in the Austin axe murders were Ula Phillips and Susan Honecker. Both of these women were killed on December 24th by an axe. Susan and Eula were different from the other victims because they were both white, whereas all the other 5 victims were black.
The most likely theory as to why this man did what he did that we found when researching was that he was angry with women living with men outside of wedlock. During this time, living with men out of wedlock was still quite frowned upon, so it is not an outlandish hypothesis to think this is what drove the Austin axe murders. Something to take note of as well is that drinking in America was a huge problem back then. Alcohol was consumed frequently by many as a form of release. This could have also been a factor as to why a man could have been filled with such rage to brutally murder 8 people.
To this day, these murders still remain unsolved. This is largely due to the old police tactics used. The servant girl annihilator is one of the earliest serial killers known. The concept is one that is not known until long after these murders. Police found it nearly impossible that one man was capable of committing these horrific acts. This caused up to 400 men to be arrested in connection to the murders. Forensics were also nowhere near as advanced back then as they are now. The use of fingerprints in criminal cases was not used until 1911, and matching DNA was not a concept created until almost 100 years after these murders. Despite the lack of forensic science available, police were able to examine the perpetrator's footprints and note that he was missing a toe on one of his feet.
The police also withheld much of the investigation from the public in hopes that it would help weed out any pretenders and find the true culprit, the biggest thing being the footprints. The main suspect, however, throughout our research was a man named Nathan Elgin. Elgin was found one night in February of 1886 attacking a woman in her yard. Police came to apprehend the suspect, but when Elgin pulled a knife out, they shot him in the spine, ultimately leading to his death. When examining his body, they discovered that Elgin was missing one of his toes, the same one the murderer was missing. The police also withheld this information from the public in case Elgin was not the real killer. Because of this, the husbands of both Eula Phillips and Susan Honecker were both arrested and brought to trial for their death of their wives. Even with this evidence pointing to Elgin, Phillips was found guilty.
The servant girl murders brought about terror in the city of Austin. This was not just excluded to black women, but everyone. The killer preyed on African American women, but also killed young children, such as Mary Ramsey. Men were also a possible target to the killer, since they stood in the way of his tasks, like the boyfriend of Molly Smith. The city was in shock and constant paranoia. Strangers were forced to identify themselves or else they would be evicted from the city. Curfews were also enforced on the city in order to control and protect the citizens of Austin. This included saloons that were normally open 24 hours. They were forced to close now at midnight. No one had ever heard of multiple murders committed by a single individual. Police even found it impossible. The case left a dent in the city of Austin's way of life. People, especially women, became more alert and more aware of their surroundings. Police were also made adjustments to their investigation protocols and processes. The size of law enforcement was also forced to triple in size. This case sparked improvements in case investigations, which ultimately benefited the city of Austin, considering the awful circumstances.